In addition to being clear and accurate, what should be the primary goal of any Bible translation? The answer is found in the theme of our program this month. Father, glorify your name. It's based on Jesus' words recorded at John 12 and verse 28. Let's start by examining the context of those words as found in verses 27 and 28. Now I am troubled, and what should I say? Father, save me out of this hour. Nevertheless, this is why I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came out of heaven. I have glorified it and will glorify it again. Jesus uttered these words just 4 days before his agonizing death. But even though Jesus was very troubled about what was soon to happen to him, what was his primary concern? It was for Jehovah's name to be glorified. We today are likewise concerned about the glorification of Jehovah's name and his reputation. But how can someone be glorified or made famous if nobody knows his name? Knowing God's personal name, Jehovah, is closely tied in with glorifying his reputation. In fact, knowing Jehovah's name is the very first step in that process. The June 2015 program of JW Broadcasting discussed why God's personal name should appear in all translations of the Bible. You might find it helpful to review that program. But this month, we will consider another aspect of this subject that is far more controversial, namely, should the divine name appear in the Christian Greek scriptures, or what is commonly called the New Testament? Many scholars who agree with us that the divine name should appear in the Hebrew scriptures disagree with our use of the same name in the New Testament. So what prompted the translators of the New World Translation to restore the divine name 237 times in the Christian Greek scriptures? The answer to that question involves some fascinating events that seem to be too amazing to be just coincidence. It also requires us to do some detective work. Sound intriguing? It is. So let's start our journey together. First of all, imagine you are back in the late 1940s, the time when the New World Bible Translation Committee was translating the book of Matthew. As they started the project, no doubt they realized that Matthew's account contains many quotations from the Hebrew Scriptures. Many of these contain the Tetragrammaton, that is, the divine name in Hebrew letters, in the original text. For example, let's consider Matthew 22, verse 44. This verse records Jesus quoting the words of Psalm 110, verse 1. Jehovah said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. But did Jesus use the divine name when making this quote? Or did he substitute the divine name with an equivalent such as Lord? Well, the brothers would have realized that many editions of the King James Version did something very interesting in Matthew 22:44. In that verse, the English word Lord is written in capital letters. This technique is used throughout the King James Version to indicate where the original Hebrew text uses the divine name. So using Lord in capital letters in this verse, in effect acknowledges that the name of God was originally in this quote. The implication is that Jesus used God's name when making this quote. However, in the years prior to the release of the New World Translation, many scholars argued that long before Jesus came to earth, the Jewish people had already removed the Tetragrammaton from the Greek translation of the Hebrew text, the Septuagint. If true, that would mean that copies of the holy writings used in Jesus' day would not have contained the divine name. So, what should the translation committee do? Should they use the divine name in their translation or not? This is where the story becomes intriguing. Around that time, some exciting discoveries were made that proved those scholars wrong. One of these discoveries was documented by the brothers in the foreword of the 1950 edition of the New World Translation of the Christian Greek Scriptures. It involves some papyri, copies of the Septuagint, that dated back to around the time of Jesus. What did these papyri fragments reveal? Let's find out in this documentary report.
In 1950, the New World Translation of the Christian Greek Scriptures was released.
I have the extreme pleasure of releasing the New World Translation of the Christian Greek Scriptures.
This translation was unique in that it restored the divine name, Jehovah, 237 times in the main text of the so-called New Testament. But how could they do that, considering that for centuries, many Bibles did not use Jehovah's name? And why did the divine name need to be restored?
The oldest copies we have available do not use the divine name in the Christian Greek Scriptures. They use substitutes like God or Lord.
Very early on, the copyists of those original manuscripts, they simply replaced, they got in the practice of replacing God's name. We know that this it's not a translation because one is a name, the other one is a title. It's not even a synonym for Jehovah, for a name.
Since the Greek Scriptures were an inspired addition to the sacred Hebrew Scriptures, in fact, Jehovah's name, God's name, was used some 7,000 times in the Hebrew Scriptures. The sudden disappearance in the Greek text is inconsistent.
Even though the New World Bible Translation Committee believed that Jehovah's name should appear in the text of the Christian Greek Scriptures, they also knew that at that time virtually all Bible scholars disagreed with that belief. Those scholars argued that by the time of Jesus, even the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, the Septuagint, no longer contained the divine name. So why would the writers of the New Testament use the divine name when their copies of the Holy Scriptures in Greek did not contain the Tetragrammaton? This view was based on faulty information. How so? Did the Septuagint still use the divine name in Jesus' time? Let's consider one piece of evidence that answers this question.
Something amazing happened in 1944. A theological journal published a picture of a Greek Septuagint fragment from the Papyrus Fuad 266 collection. Now inside that fragment, there was the divine name. In the Greek text, you had the Tetragrammaton, not just once but throughout. Now this fragment was very old, dating back to the 1st century BCE. But the important point is, this was proof, clear proof, that the divine name was originally there.
2 Jehovah's Witnesses were asked to obtain photographs of these fragments, which were located in Cairo, Egypt.
New World Translation Committee were very interested in this because they started translating the Greek Scriptures in 1947.
After obtaining permission, pictures of 12 of the fragments were published in the foreword of the New World Translation of the Christian Greek Scriptures.
What amazes me about this is the timing. When our brothers, this translation, New World Translation Committee, did their research before even translating, suddenly something that was unknown until essentially 1944 came to light that confirms that the eternal name of God has to be revealed. It cannot no longer be hidden. It should be shown to everyone who wants to worship Jehovah.
This careful preservation supports what Jesus said in prayer at John 17:26 when he said to his Father, "I have made your name known and will make it known." As Jehovah's Witnesses, we are proud to be a people for his name.
Knowing his name is essential to know Jehovah himself. And the fact that Jehovah has provided this arrangement through his people, it makes it very clear that he was gathering a people for his name.
This is why this Bible translation is so beautiful, because it brings us closer to Jehovah. Jehovah is not just a Lord somewhere which could apply to anyone, but He is Jehovah, our God. He extends His hands to us and says, well, I'm Jehovah. Call me by that name.
What an amazing find! They found proof that the divine name in Hebrew letters was included in the text of the Septuagint that would have been available in Jesus' day. And just at the right time, the time when the members of the translation committee were making the decision as to whether they should use the name Jehovah in their translation of the Christian Greek scriptures. We are so happy that the brothers were able to find this information, because these fragments were not released for general publication until much later, in 1971, years after the time when the committee needed to make that vital decision. But that's not all. Do you remember what other important material was discovered starting in 1947? It was the Dead Sea Scrolls. Many of these scrolls were dated to around the time when Jesus was on earth. And what did these scrolls contain over and over again? You guessed it, the Tetragrammaton, the divine name. Isn't it interesting that these discoveries were made around the time that our brothers were translating the New World Translation? Is this just coincidence? Or do you see Jehovah's hand in this? What has happened in the years since that time? It's important to note that the divine name is consistently used in fragments of the Septuagint that date from the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE. This has led some scholars to acknowledge the possibility that Jesus and his disciples used the divine name when making these quotations. But we need to remember that Hebrew scripture quotations account for approximately 1/3 of the 237 times the New World Translation restores the divine name in the Christian Greek scriptures. So what about the other 2/3 of occurrences? Well, this brings us to the part of our program that involves some detective work. Imagine that you are a detective and you catch an art thief who has stolen over 200 original pieces of art from various museums and art galleries. This thief not only stole each piece of art, but he also substituted it with a copy. So you need to start an investigation and follow the clues. First of all, you need to find out where each painting was located originally. Once you have verified that fakes are hanging in those locations, you would be in a position to return the originals to their proper locations. In a similar way, we have solid evidence that a crime was committed in the 2nd and 3rd century CE. Apostate Christians removed the divine name from manuscripts of the Bible and replaced it with Kyrios, the Greek word for Lord. There is much evidence for this conclusion. So they are like the art thief in our illustration. They stole something valuable when they removed Jehovah's name from the Christian Greek scriptures. But we have a problem. There are no copies of the Christian Greek scriptures from the 1st century for us to examine. The earliest existing manuscripts that would have a bearing on this matter date from the late 2nd century onward, a time when we know that the crime had already been committed. Jehovah's name had already been removed. So how do we know where Jehovah's name originally appeared in the Greek text before the apostates removed it? Well, just like the detective in our illustration, we need to start an investigation and follow the clues. To do our work properly, we need to examine every time the word Lord appears in the text and see if it refers to Jehovah, to Jesus, or to some other person with the title Lord. Basically, there are 5 clues that will help us to find out where the original artwork that is, Jehovah's name, needs to be returned to. Let's scrutinize these clues. The first clue is, as we've already mentioned, the easiest clue, where the title Lord appears in quotations from the Hebrew Scriptures that originally used the divine name. The second clue is where the Greek text contains a Hebrew idiom that would normally contain the divine name. For example, if someone says in English, "He escaped by the skin of his," what word do you expect? Teeth, not eye. Yes, the expression is skin of his teeth. This is similar with Hebrew expressions. Some of these contain the divine name. For example, the expression found at Matthew 1:20 is the angel of Jehovah. So whenever we find a Greek translation of a Hebrew idiom that uses the divine name, this is another clue that Jehovah's name should be there. The third clue is where the term Lord appears in the context surrounding a quotation that is originally attributed to Jehovah. An example of this is Matthew 1:22. All of this actually came about to fulfill what was spoken by Jehovah through his prophet, saying. The quotation that immediately follows at Matthew 1 verse 23 is taken from Isaiah 7 verse 14. This is a prophetic message spoken by Jehovah through Isaiah. The fourth clue is when we see in the Greek text where there is no definite article before Kyrios, the Greek word for Lord, in places where the Greek grammar normally expects a definite article. This clue may indicate that a proper name, such as Jehovah, originally was there in the text and was removed from later manuscripts and replaced with Kyrios. To illustrate the importance of this clue, imagine that you are a newspaper reporter who is reporting on a car accident. You report that Joe Smith, the driver of the vehicle, was killed in the accident. But just before the story goes to press, your editor informs you that Joe Smith's relatives have not yet been notified of his death. So you are told to remove his name from the report. You do that. But in doing so, you forget to add the before the word driver. What would happen? Your report would say, as a result of the accident, driver was killed. That sounds strange, doesn't it? It sounds like driver is the name of the person killed. That's because you suppressed the name and forgot to add the appropriate article. That is similar to what our symbolic art thieves did when removing Jehovah's name from the Bible. An example of this is found in the Greek text of Mark 13, verse 20. In fact, unless Lord had cut short the days, no flesh would be saved. That sounds like Lord is a name, and clearly it should be Jehovah's name. That's why the New World Translation restores the divine name in this verse. However, even in cases where the definite article occurs before the word Lord, there may be other strong reasons for viewing Lord as a substitute for the divine name, like the ones we already discussed. The final clue is where the divine name needs to be added to avoid ambiguity. An example of this is in Mark 5 and verse 19. There Jesus says to a man he healed, "Go home to your relatives and report to them all the things Jehovah has done for you and the mercy he has shown you." How do we know that Lord here refers to Jehovah and not Jesus? Well, in recording the same event, Luke 8 verse 39 uses the Greek word theos, God, supporting the thought that Kyrios, Lord, at Mark 5:19 is used with reference to Jehovah God. So these 5 clues help the New World Bible Translation Committee to ascertain where the name Jehovah should be restored to the biblical text. In this way, they were able to right the wrong that was committed by apostate Christians in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Or in other words, they were able to return the figurative pieces of stolen artwork to their proper places. If you would like to review these 5 clues, you will find a detailed explanation in Appendix C of the study edition of the New World Translation. You can either find this in the JW Library app or online at Watchtower Online Library. In the same Appendix C, you will find a list of what we call J references that support these decisions.